Today I want to give a broad context arising from a number of the inquiries that I've been involved in. But I was reflecting the other night in giving a speech to a Catholic community that the Catholics talk about the notion of the signs of the time. And it arose from the Vatican Council that was held in the mid-1960s, which was meant to revolutionise the Church. But you've got to be very careful about misreading the signs of the times. I was reflecting on the fact, having teenage children, that when your teenage child suddenly says he loves you, you might misread this as affection rather than a prelude to asking for money or borrowing the car. The other day in Australia, the greatest event that took place in the nation, of course, was not the climate change legislation or the migration bill, but the kiss. The kiss between the former Prime Minister and the current Prime Minister. I, of course, read that as simply a sign of civility. But I was wrong, because what you needed to do was to have a body language expert, an image consultant, and a range of political commentators tell you that a kiss isn't a kiss, it's something else. And anyone who kisses at this conference is under great scrutiny. The third was I was attending the Catholic Education Commission in Adelaide recently. There was a wonderful speaker from the United Kingdom who related of a particular minister of the Crown over there, a former minister who was used to getting, as they say, very merry. He was on an official engagement to Peru and at this dinner, and he was seated next to a guest who was presented in a red and white outfit. The minister, being naturally inebriated as the music started, turned to the guest and said, "Could I have this dance?" The person said, "No. Firstly, you're drunk. Secondly, it's the national anthem of Peru. And thirdly, I happen to be the Archbishop of Lima." And so always be careful about the signs. But arising from the reports that we've done, can I just elaborate that the Productivity Commission is a strange animal, and it arose from many years back. Was the Tariff Board, or as some say, the Anti-Tariff Board. It became the Industry Commission, the Industry Assistance Commission, then the Productivity Commission. And since the 2005 alone, I've been involved in a number of reports that directly impact on you and the Skills Council. The Australian Health Workforce, the Aged Care Inquiry, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Currently, I'm involved in the Early Childhood Development Workforce. We have going on at the moment, or just finished, the vet workforce, the schools workforce, and of course I was involved in the not-for-profit inquiry. I think I'm a natural inquirer. I may not have any other credentials. But today I want to reflect on some of the broad themes within which you work, and they do impact on workforce. And the first of those is very much to understand that the agenda for all of the reforms in those areas is more and more founded in the notion of wellness and well-being. Australians today are a nation in change in terms of their expectations and aspirations for the services that are provided. And as providers, both as government and non-government agencies and for profit, we also recognise that part of that changing agenda is not simply to see services as such, but rather an agenda that enhances the wellness and well-being of the community at large. Never more so is that seen in the Aged Care Inquiry, where the whole agenda was shaped by that notion of people being able to age well and indeed to die well. It's also seen very heavily in the rights-based agendas that exist within the disability sector, where it's simply not about providing services to people with disabilities, but it is about enhancing their capacity to access life's opportunities and to enjoy what life gives to all of us. That wellness and well-being agenda does have a practical application, as I will show, and it is important that we understand how that impacts on current and future policy considerations. The first of those is there's a clear move by government, the Commonwealth and state governments, to embrace the notion of client-directed or client-centred care and support. This moves us beyond the notion of person-centred. In the community sector and the health sector, and in others, we would have long ago embraced the notion of person-centred, that is, trying to place the care of the individual at the centre of our decision-making. But it is not true that we actually gave them much choice and much empowerment. Even indeed in the not-for-profit sector that often espouses these notions, and which I have been associated with for 30 years, practice was never close to the rhetoric that we used. But if we look at the reforms going forward, we now see that the consumer or the client is at the centre of decision-making and indeed of control. The reforms in relation to the aged care system, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and many of the health reforms clearly indicate that going forward, and based on assessed need, individuals will be able to choose the provider of their choice and will be able to access services which are much more akin to their aspirations. The day of the government determining what services will be provided, where and by whom, is fast changing. The aged care reforms, if adopted by the Commonwealth Government, will in fact change that, where providers will be able to provide any range of services and consumers will be able to access those services based on an assessment through what we've called a gateway, and those entitlements will travel with the individual. More importantly, the services will in fact become much more home-based, as Minister Struthers indicated. By 2050, 3.6 million Australians will access aged care services. That is, most of us here, if we're not already dead by then. Of that 3.6 million, at least 3 million will receive those services in the home. And so the move forward to home-based community care in the aged care sector is well established and it will grow significantly. Of course, in that number, there is a significant number of people that will access residential aged care services, but community-based home care will occur. In relation to health services, we already see in Western Australia the hospitals in the home concept, where hundreds of patients are actually cared for by a virtual hospital provided by a not-government profit provider in the homes. That model will in fact increase. And we will see increasing use of community-based services rather than institutional-based services across the whole spectrum of community services. That dramatically changes the nature of community service delivery and health service delivery in Australia. Many organisations are geared up for that, but equally many are not. The nature of the workforce, the nature of the training, the nature of the support services, the use of technology, particularly home-based technology, will be critical if we're actually going to meet this new need. And yet, it is also true that for some, choice is an illusion, and therefore what we need to do is to ensure that consumer choice, client-directed arrangements, support those that are both vulnerable and are less able to make decisions without support. And so the rise of intermediaries, particularly within the not-for-profit sector, will be very extensive. We will see a rapid expansion of case management, care coordination and brokerage across the sector, as more and more people have access to entitlements and are able to and expected to make choice, but will need assistance in the making of that choice. Issues of conflict of interest between the provider of service and that particular role will be important to watch as we move forward. And so a new area of activity will emerge. Not new in concept, case management and care coordination is fundamental, but people have grossly underestimated what will be required as we move forward in this particular area. And what are the skills of the workforce for that particular group? A second and fundamental issue is a more market-oriented or client-directed funding arrangements. Inherent in what I've just indicated, and particularly in relation to the proposed National Disability Insurance Scheme, but also in the aged care reforms, and in higher education and in early childhood development, what do we see? And that is the money flows with the consumer. That money, that entitlement, however described, will in fact now come with the consumer. Of course, for organisations that brings some uncertainty. Those that have been used to tendering for a particular contract, obtaining a number of packages or services, will now suddenly be in a true market. And of course, the market is opened up between government, non-government and not-for-profit operators. Now again, in the health area, in aged care, to a limited degree in disability services, but extensively in early childhood, we are already in those markets. What are the dangers and what are the issues for certain groups? For example, that market-based model is not appropriate in areas where there are what they call thin markets. For example, remote communities, Indigenous services. In the aged care reform, we acknowledge that block funding by governments will continue to be needed in those areas. Also, for example, the care of homeless men and women in Australia as they age is a critically important area. a growing important area. How will we fund that? And clearly there it may be that block funding continues to be an important element. So again, it's not the application of a principle universally, it's an application of a principle which then has regard to the particular circumstances of vulnerable people and vulnerable communities. This, however, does in fact change but the nature of the workforce again. As monies flow to different sources, as certain providers become attractive and others become less attractive, others grow in viability and some less viable, so too will workforce move between providers and indeed between sectors. A young person entering the workforce in Australia today will change their career, not their job, at least 3 times, probably 5 times. My children, who are just entering university, will in fact probably change their careers at least 3 times. But they will change employers much more frequently than that. We've already seen that to a degree, and many of you are used to that. But put it in colloquialism, you ain't seen nothing yet. You can argue the pros and cons of it, and you can desire a different future, but it is unlikely to be much different from what I've just indicated. Another flow-on effect of these principles, but also of wellness and well-being, are systems that are actually responsive to restoring people to wellness. The aged care system has perverse incentives built into it. It is not in the interests of a consumer or client, once accessing aged care system, to ever leave it. They fear leaving it. Having gained a service, they fear that if they ever leave that system, they'll never get back into it. A person with a disability will never leave the disability system for fear that if they ever need an increased level of support, they will not be able to access it. Equally, it is in the interests of providers to see consumers actually worsen their outcomes, actually become more frail and more in need of services, because that's how the funding flows. It's a perverse model. And so what we have to do if we genuinely believe in a wellness and well-being model is to create a system that actually looks at restoration to wellness, restoration to well-being, where it is appropriate, with the certain knowledge that if I need additional services, I can access those at a later time. This is a very significant change, but it has major changes in relation to the way in which services are operated. Rehabilitation, restorative services, re-engagement services, reablement services, all with different names and different purposes, will become a significant part of the care provision, particularly in the aged care area. Residential aged care services will look nothing like they look today. What will happen in the future will not be what the government determines. Nobody will say to TRICARE or any other provider, this is the type of aged care service you should provide. Each provider will need to make their own decisions. And that aged care service may in fact have a very substantial number of beds for people with significant dementia. They will certainly have people that suffer frailty as a consequence of ageing. But they will also have transitional care, they will have restorative care, they will have rehabilitative care, and they will have care that I've not even thought of. That has dramatic impacts for the workforce, and the rigidities that currently exist in the workforce will seem absurd in the years ahead. In fact, they will seem as extreme barriers to achieving those outcomes. So those that like a clear future, a certain future, a future of definitions and classifications that are unable to be changed, particularly in the health area, will in fact find themselves creating barriers and in fact not allowing the systems to respond to both the needs and aspirations of the future generations. And the last point that I want to make is that training is not enough. In and of itself, we can increase the training and qualification levels within the system, but we actually need to fundamentally reform and change the systems. When I was appointed as a Commissioner to Australia's health workforce, I was aware of, but actually astonished by the rigidities in that system and the barriers that existed. As a lawyer by training, I thought, I had dealt with difficult people. Lawyers by nature are just pains in the neck. No offence to Chris. But I've got to tell you, they actually looked lovely and absolutely almost teddy bear compared to the doctors, nurses and allied health unions and professional groups that we encountered. These absolute rigid silos, this determination to protect the indefensible, the extraordinary inability to actually work with each other were hallmarks of our health system. It is true today that there have been significant changes, and I noticed a number of the stands outside represent the outcomes of some of the recommendations that we made. But systemic reform is important. What we learnt in that inquiry was that the cogs that make a system must, in fact, be realigned. When we started that, everybody wanted us to say the same thing that every inquiry has ever said. We need more doctors, we need more nurses, and we need more money. Well, can I just use the colloquialism, duh. Of course there's going to be more nurses, more doctors, and more money. The one thing you can be absolutely certain of in the health system is that we are going to move from 9% of GDP to something in the order of 14% of GDP by 2050. There is no question that the system will have more money. And there is no question that there will be more nurses and more doctors. But if that were the answer, we should never have been given the inquiry. Because what we needed to look at were issues around workforce innovation, the way in which you change scopes of practice, the way in which those changes are evaluated, both in terms of efficacy and cost effectiveness. We needed to look at the way in which education and training was provided across from specialists through to allied health workers. We needed to examine the need for national accreditation schemes and national registration schemes to break down the barriers that existed both between the Commonwealth and the states and between the states. And lastly, and actually most importantly, but often forgotten, is we needed to look at the financial incentives through Medicare and other arrangements that drove the system. We have a system at the moment that disproportionately pays specialists extraordinarily high salaries, without justification in some instances, whilst we pay other people an appalling wage level. Will anybody actually deal with that? Well, no. Because the minute you do, we get the howls of special interest. We now live in a society, in an economy, in a country, where he or she who can scream the loudest seems to think that's the way in which public policy should be determined. And yet at the end of the day, if we're talking about the wellness and well-being of the Australian population, we need to actually tackle those issues. The way we did that is to look at the structural and systemic issues that needed to be adopted. So they are important issues, and they are important issues that go across most of those inquiries to which we've referred. Let me just raise then a few controversial issues, and then some specifically about training. The first is a controversial one, I suspect, is the view that increasing qualifications automatically leads to increasing outcomes. The early childhood development inquiry that I'm on presumes and is based on the national agreement that's been entered into by the 9 governments. That is the early learning framework. And it assumes and accepts that there will be increases in qualifications in preschools, long day care, family day care, and so on. And we support that. But it is not true that simply increasing the level of qualification in and of itself creates an outcome. In fact, the evidence is very unclear in relation to that. The evidence of moving from a 3-year qualification to a 4-year qualification is in fact very unclear. The requirement in Victoria for child health nurses to also have midwifery qualifications is unclear. I'm not suggesting that they're not appropriate. I am suggesting that the evidence base upon which we make these decisions is not as clear as the advocates for them. The problem with that is it has very substantial consequential flow-on effects in terms of resource allocation. If we get this wrong, we can expend an enormous amount of money increasing qualifications without actually improving outcomes. And alternative policies or approaches may have been more appropriate. So it's not arguing about the qualification. It is saying that these have significant resource allocation effects and therefore outcome effects. Universal application of principles in policy can be very dangerous, when in fact the greatest need is with Indigenous people or people in remote locations or people with special needs. Often they are the very ones that in the resource allocation miss out. The very ones that would benefit the most from the reforms are the ones that are least likely to get access to them. And that's a serious policy concern. A second is ratios. I understand fully why nurses believe ratios are important in hospital systems and wish to introduce them into aged care services. Nevertheless, they are a very blunt instrument and one that have unintended consequences. I've indicated to you in the aged care space, for example, that I can't predict with any certainty what a residential aged care facility will look like, and neither can you, and neither can workers. As a consequence of that, if we go to ratios, fixed ratios, we understand that clients, but particularly their carers and their family members, would welcome that. But what are the consequences of doing so? What are the consequences of imposing ratios on smaller facilities in regional areas where in fact there is no possibility that that model can be affordable? What occurs? Do we in fact reduce the level of services in those communities? Or do we increase the subsidies to an unaffordable level? So again, it's not that ratios in and of themselves are a bad idea, and they're not without merit. But we do have to be much more careful about proposing solutions which, one, may not actually deal with the issue at hand, but secondly, may have perverse outcomes. And in the aged care area, this is a particular concern. It is absolutely true that there are aged care service providers that are understaffing. That is absolutely the case. And it is true that the regulators, both now and the proposed ones, need to address this issue. One of the ways of addressing this is that one of the new regulators we've proposed will in fact recommend to government the pricing of services. And that pricing will take into account appropriate staff skills and staff mixes. But it's not about reasserting notions of ratio. The third, and one that we agree with Minister Struthers on, is competitive wages within the sector. It is not possible to attract and retain workers within the community and health sector without competitive wages. Again, let me take in the early childhood development area. It is pretty easy to argue the case that a teacher in a long day care centre or a preschool should be paid a comparable wage and set of conditions to that of a primary school or infant school teacher. It is equally true that nurses that operate in the aged care sector should in fact be paid at an equivalent level with those nurses that are in the acute hospital system. But for those that are on certificates, those on diplomas, it is a much more difficult area. The Commission absolutely supports an increase in the wages for those in those areas. It's been very clear about that. For many, that would come as a shock and a surprise that the Productivity Commission would ever acknowledge wage increases. But it is important. But here, the notion of parity is much more difficult. Who do you compare yourself to? And that is an issue that has to be worked through, and we've had many discussions with the unions, the United Voice and other unions, about that issue. What is the best mechanism by which that should be achieved? Of course, it's got to do with government funding, but it's also got to do with the throw-on effects of the co-contribution by clients. So, for example, in the early childhood area, fees will rise. The government's contribution will certainly rise. But we've just done some modelling, which will be available when our final report comes out when the government releases in a few months, which will show that there will be significant fee increases. Now, interestingly, what is the flow-on effect of that? Well, one, it may be that people will say, well, we can't afford it. But the actual flow-on effect is that you may actually decrease demand for services. That is, people withdraw their children from certain forms of early childhood and place them in other forms or not at all, potentially with women withdrawing from the labour market. Now, the extent of that has to be carefully analysed. But again, a decision about wages, who pays for it, has a long-term consequence. So when we look at these issues, recognising that to attract and retain workers we need to improve remuneration, we must be conscious of what are the flow-on effects, and then for public policy, how do we deal with that? Economists talk about this as second and third round effects. One of the difficulties in Australia today is the lack of ability by many to be able to think about the second and third round effect. We're so in the moment, we're so keen on getting the first piece of reform up, we forget about the second or third round effects. And one of the issues for advocacy bodies outside of government is they must become much more sophisticated in understanding what are the consequences, good and bad, of the decisions we make. And the last point that I want to make is about transitional throughout life. This is an area in which you have a particular expertise, and that is, how do we ensure that people can change careers in the way that I've indicated, but still remain within the health and the community service sector? It is chronic. The health system, up until more recent times, has a chronic problem that people are unable to move from one part of the health system to another easily. That is also true in some of the other community service areas. How do we create systems that allow people to move more flexibly throughout their life in and out of different roles, always based on appropriate competencies? The question there about recognising prior learning is a huge issue, and the Commonwealth Government is taking some initiatives in relation to that. But that issue is a significant issue. Talking about transitions in work throughout life really does put our system under stress. Can you do it? Is it easily able to be done? Can I move easily from disability to age to health or back and forwards as my life circumstances change? And that's an issue that you understand much better than I. And again, in our various reports and the ones underway, we've tried to make some comments about that. Let me turn in the last few minutes to the more concrete area of quality of training and skilling. And I just want to draw on a couple of reports, and I don't want you to take any of this as necessarily gospel, and it's all contestable. Everything in the world is contestable. And certainly if you're in the Productivity Commission, you know that just about everything you say has someone who thinks that you're either ideologically obsessed, crazy, not evidence-based, or live on another planet. They're only just some of the reasons people give for disagree with me and the Commission. The first is really about the content. And one of the issues that's arisen in relation to early childhood development and ageing is whether or not the content of the courses are appropriate, taking into account the reforms that are underway. There seems to be a lag effect occurring where the courses being offered are not necessarily being as responsive as they need to be to the changing reforms and agendas. As a consequence of that, unless we can create an environment where we can more quickly and appropriately change the content of courses, both at Certificate 3, 4 and diploma levels, then we run the risk of actually training a workforce that are not necessarily skilled for the changes that are about to occur. The new quality framework, the new early learning framework in early childhood development is a case in point. We're about to enter the rollout of that phase in the next couple of years. Yet it's not absolutely clear that the skills being developed through training are necessarily appropriate. And again, it's not a criticism, it's saying how can we create a system of training and work that is more responsive to that particular issue. A second issue related is about the notion of competencies and what's being sacrificed, or what are the dangers in this. Nobody for a moment would argue that we want to move away from competency-based training. But it is clear in the aged care report, the disability report, the early childhood report, that there is serious concern about some of the courses being offered at the present time. Extraordinarily short face-to-face teaching, almost non-existent practicums. At the moment we have over 5,000 RTOs. The quality is highly variable. The system is not working well, and yet we seem not capable of making the necessary changes to affect that. Over and over again, in a number of the inquiries, we have heard about the variability in quality of candidates coming out of RTOs. Over and over again, we've heard of case studies of exceptionally short courses, exceptionally short practicums, and very poor assessment. We've seen state governments start to talk about preferred lists of suppliers, that is, training providers. Once you see a preferred list by a government, you know the system is stuffed, to use an inelegant expression. And it is. And we said to the government involved, well, why would you have a preferred list? Does that mean the rest that are not on the preferred list are no good? Well, of course, they don't answer that. But of course, the answer is yes. Does that not indicate that there's something wrong in the quality assurance processes in relation to the courses? Now again, in a number of the reports, your Skills Council would be aware of recommendations we've made, and it won't come as any surprise that in the Early Childhood Development Report, the final, there will be further recommendations in this area. But it is a serious issue. We don't want to go back to a system where you prescribe the exact number of teaching hours and the exact number of hours of practicum. But it is unacceptable if the government is about to expend huge amounts of money in aged care and very substantial amounts in early childhood and very substantial amounts in disability, which they are, to then inject that money into training providers and into courses that do not deliver appropriate skills or competencies. That is unacceptable. And as an industry, working with government, I'm sure you're aware of that, and we need to address that. And then the report that the Commission did on vet workforce, which I wasn't involved in, there were also examples and recommendations. Thirdly, there is a need in relation to RTOs generally, both government and non-government, to actually have greater transparencies. And so as a consequence of that, there are recommendations, for example, that there would be the publication details of audit outcomes of RTOs. And some have suggested, I think we've recommended in the vet workforce, that the MySkills website would contain reliable performance indicators of RTOs to address in some part this issue of transparency. It is true that providers, however, generally will say to you that they already know the good quality providers of the RTOs and use them. However, that is rose-coloured glasses stuff, because we know equally well there are providers that will go for the cheapest, quickest solution to their workforce shortages. Now, we know that. It's only a small percentage of the industry. But nevertheless, one of the issues that people raise is the lack of transparency as to how does an objective person on the outside of the system know what is being provided. Lastly, let me just conclude in relation specifically to regional and remote and Indigenous areas. It is absolutely critical that we encourage more Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to become workers within the community service and health area. It really is shocking that we've actually seen a decline in the number of Aboriginal health workers, not an increase, and that we continue to see a very, very low level of participation by Indigenous people in this sector. Given that so much of the work that you do, particularly in Queensland, Western Australia, Northern Territory, is to and with Indigenous Australians. And so there is a real issue about how do we deliver services, how do we live training services, professional development to those particular individuals and to those communities. A number of the recommendations in our reports try to deal with that. But one of the issues there is that we have very poor evaluation of the current programs. When we looked at the health workforce, and particularly rural health workforce, when we've looked at it in early childhood development, when we've looked at it in aged care, there is no strong evaluation to tell us where governments should be expending more money. Yes, there's a plethora of initiatives being established by the 9 governments. Some of those must be providing great dividends, and others must be a complete waste of money. And yet we are struggling to actually understand. So I support Karen Struthers' comments that we need specialised program and funding for remote and regional communities, and in particular for Indigenous communities. We absolutely must engage Indigenous people in this workforce, and we must upskill them. In the early childhood development area, with the government requirements, the approach at the moment is to exempt Indigenous services from the new framework. That is a misguided approach. They, in fact, should be part of the framework, but with special timelines and special considerations, but ultimately getting to the same point. But just there, most workers are struggling to get Certificate 1 and Certificate 2 qualifications, yet alone requiring them to get to 3, 4 or diploma level. So my point about this is, again, I don't want to be prescriptive about what we should be doing in remote or regional areas or Indigenous, but we need a method of evaluation that guides governments. Governments are willing to invest heavily in the areas that you practice in health, in early childhood, in the community services, in the disability areas. But it is hard to recommend to government that they invest heavily unless they can be sure that the outcomes match the investment. So I leave on the conclusion that evaluation is absolutely critical if we move forward. And I think governments are entitled, consumers are entitled, carers are entitled, and the community at large to know that the money is being well spent. Ladies and gentlemen, you're in an exciting space. All of the figures indicated, including by Minister Evans this morning, shows that the workforce needs in this area will grow dramatically. You're in an exciting place because finally we're starting to recognise the skills and talents that have long existed in this sector. We're starting to see real commitment in skills training. We're starting to see real commitment in enhancing qualifications and lifelong learning opportunities. It's a great time to be part of this sector. And I hope that our work contributes to making the future for you and for the sector, but more importantly for the Australian people, a place where their wellness and their well-being will be enhanced. Thank you very much.